It started as an ordinary afternoon in a quiet city park, a place where anyone should feel safe. She had stopped there for a brief moment, holding a coffee cup in one hand and her phone in the other, scrolling through emails. The air was crisp, a soft breeze brushing through the trees, yet the atmosphere shifted suddenly, and it wasn't because of the weather. A loud, authoritative voice broke through the calm. "What do you think you're doing here?" The words were sharp, cutting through the serene ambience like a blade. She looked up, startled, seeing a tall man in a uniform walking towards her. His expression was cold, almost calculated. For a moment, confusion painted her face, but she quickly stood straighter, trying to maintain her composure. "Excuse me," she said, her voice calm but tinged with disbelief. "I said, what are you doing here? Do you belong here?" "Because you look out of place," he barked, his hand resting threateningly on his belt where his badge gleamed in the sunlight. It wasn't the first time she'd encountered someone like him, but the sting of his words hit her like a slap in the face. "I'm just here for a moment," she responded, attempting to defuse the tension, but her calmness seemed to provoke him further. "Show me some ID," he demanded, taking another step forward. Her brows furrowed in confusion. "ID? What for? I'm not doing anything wrong." "You're loitering," he snapped, his voice rising. "And I've seen people like you around here before. Always causing trouble." "People like me," she repeated, her voice trembling slightly. "What does that mean?" He smirked, leaning closer as though he wanted her to feel every ounce of disdain in his presence. "You know exactly what I mean. Don't play dumb. You think you can just walk into any neighborhood and act like you belong?" She took a step back, her breath hitching in her throat. "I don't have to explain myself to you. I have every right to be here." "Every right," he laughed bitterly. "We'll see about that. Don't move." He pulled out a radio, calling in a code that she didn't recognize but could feel the weight of its implications. She glanced around, noticing how a few passers-by paused, their expressions a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Yet, no one intervened. She felt the burning sensation of humiliation creeping up her neck as the officer stared her down, his posture screaming authority, dominance. "You really think you're untouchable, don't you?" he sneered, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "Well, let me make something clear. People like you never win." She clenched her fists, the heat of anger bubbling under her skin. But she stayed quiet, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to fight back, to say something, to stand her ground. But she knew. Oh, she knew exactly how these situations could spiral out of control if she wasn't careful. Another officer arrived, their interaction brief. The second officer gave her a once-over but seemed more hesitant, glancing nervously between her and the first officer. "Are you sure about this?" the second officer whispered, just loud enough for her to catch. "I'm in charge here," the first officer shot back, his tone dripping with finality. "Now, get back to your patrol." The humiliation was suffocating. She stood there, frozen, every muscle in her body tense as he continued to berate her, questioning her reasons for being in the park, insinuating that she was there to case the area or disturb the peace. His accusations grew more absurd with every passing moment, each word feeling like another punch to her dignity. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. "I'm done with this," she said firmly, her voice cutting through his tirade like a blade. "I've tried to be patient, but you've crossed a line." "Oh, really?" he scoffed, crossing his arms over his chest. "And what exactly are you going to do about it?" Her response was a steady glare, unyielding and filled with a quiet fire that seemed to unsettle him, if only for a second. But he quickly masked it, stepping forward again, his chest puffed out. "You can either cooperate, or I can take you down to the station. Your choice." The tension was unbearable. Everyone around them was watching now, and the air seemed thick with unspoken words, unacknowledged biases. She felt her chest tighten, her mind racing. And yet, despite the anger boiling inside her, she forced herself to take a deep breath. She needed to wait for the right moment, for the perfect time to show him just how wrong he was. Because what he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly imagine, was that he had just made the biggest mistake of his career. What happens next will not only change his life forever but will leave everyone around them speechless. How could one moment of prejudice and arrogance lead to a downfall so devastating? Stay with us, because this story is only just beginning. At Plough of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism and discrimination. To our black viewers and allies, we see you, we stand with you, and we honor your stories. This channel is a place where justice and empowerment take center stage, and we believe in creating narratives that inspire and uplift. Thank you for being here, and we hope you enjoy this powerful story. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and join us in standing up for what's right. Enjoy the journey, because this one will leave you speechless. The city hummed with its usual rhythm, a blend of car horns, distant chatter, and the occasional bark of a dog echoing through the streets. It was a place of contrasts, where the polished storefronts of coffee shops and boutiques often stood just blocks away from neighborhoods struggling to keep pace with the ever-changing tide of gentrification. Among these streets, a woman named Maya Williams moved through her day with a quiet determination, her every step a reflection of her resilience. Maya had always been the type to carry herself with confidence. Her tall frame, sharp features, and natural hair styled in a crown of tight curls made her a striking presence wherever she went. But it wasn't just her appearance that drew attention, it was the way she navigated the world, with her head held high despite the obstacles she faced. As a single mother and the first black woman to rise to a leadership position within her city's police department, Maya knew better than most how heavy the weight of expectations could be. She had grown up on the south side of the city, in a community where neighbors knew each other by name and looked out for one another. Her mother, an elementary school teacher, had instilled in her a deep sense of justice and fairness. "Treat everyone with respect," her mother used to say, even when they don't show it back. Especially then. Those words had guided Maya through years of challenges, from navigating the biases she faced in school to breaking through the rigid structures of a predominantly white police force. Now, as deputy chief of police, Maya carried not only her own dreams but the hopes of others who saw her success as a sign that change was possible. Her days were long, often beginning before dawn and ending well past sunset. Yet she never let the exhaustion show. To the outside world, she was unshakable, a symbol of strength and perseverance. Still, beneath her composed exterior, Maya often felt the weight of her position. She was no stranger to the microaggressions that peppered her daily life, even from those who worked alongside her. The snide remarks disguised as jokes, the subtle dismissals of her authority, the way certain officers avoided eye contact during meetings, it all added up. But Maya had learned to choose her battles wisely. She wasn't here to win popularity contests, she was here to make a difference, to hold her department accountable, and to serve her community with integrity. On this particular day, Maya had taken a rare moment to step away from her office and clear her mind. The demands of her job had been especially intense lately, with mounting tensions between the police and the community. Public trust was fragile, and Maya had been working tirelessly to bridge the gap. She often attended town hall meetings, listening to the frustrations and fears of residents, many of whom had little faith in the system. She knew their pain because it was her pain too. She had lived it, and she carried it with her into every decision she made. Meanwhile, across town, Officer Darren Mitchell was finishing his patrol shift. Darren was a seasoned officer, with over a decade on the force, but his reputation was far from spotless. Known for his brash demeanor and heavy-handed approach to law enforcement, Darren had become the subject of several complaints over the years. Yet, like many officers before him, he had managed to skate by without facing serious consequences. His supervisors often turned a blind eye, chalking up his behavior to old-school policing or dismissing complaints as misunderstandings. Darren prided himself on his no-nonsense attitude. He believed in maintaining order, and in his mind, that often meant drawing hard lines. But what he saw as firmness, others saw as aggression. His biases were deeply ingrained, shaped by years of unchecked behavior and an environment that rarely held him accountable. To Darren, people like Maya, those who spoke of reform and community engagement, were idealists who didn't understand the realities of the job. He viewed her as a threat to the old ways, an outsider who didn't belong in his world. As Darren made his way through the park on that fateful afternoon, his eyes landed on Maya. She was standing near a bench, her focus on her phone, completely unaware of his presence. To Darren, she looked out of place. He didn't recognize her, not as a high-ranking officer, not as a leader in his department, but as another face in the crowd. And in that moment, his biases took over. The interaction that followed was a cascade of choices, each one revealing more about Darren's character and the system that had shaped him. He approached Maya with the confidence of someone who believed he was untouchable, his tone sharp and condescending as he questioned her presence. For Maya, the encounter was all too familiar, a painful reminder of the countless times she had been judged not for who she was but for the color of her skin. As Darren's voice grew louder, drawing the attention of those nearby, Maya felt a wave of emotions, anger, frustration, humiliation. But she refused to let him see her falter. Instead, she met his accusations with calm defiance, her words measured yet firm. She had dealt with men like Darren before, and she knew better than to let him dictate the narrative. Yet, even as she held her ground, she couldn't ignore the sting of his words or the weight of the eyes watching them. For Darren, the situation was an opportunity to assert his authority. For Maya, it was a test of her patience and resolve. And for those who witnessed it, it was a moment that laid bare the deep divisions that still ran through their city. But what none of them knew was that this encounter was just the beginning, a catalyst that would set off a chain of events leading to a reckoning far greater than anyone could have imagined. By the time Darren realized who Maya was, it would be too late. The wheels of justice were already in motion, and the world as he knew it was about to change forever. What began as a chance encounter in a park would become a turning point, a moment that exposed not only Darren's prejudices but the broader flaws of the system he represented. And as Maya prepared to confront the challenges ahead, she knew one thing for certain: this was her fight, and she wasn't going to back down. The air in the park had turned heavy, not from the weather but from the weight of the tension lingering after the confrontation. Maya stood where Darren had left her, her thoughts racing but her expression calm. She had seen his type before, men who believed their authority was unshakable, their power absolute. But what gnawed at her now wasn't just Darren's behavior. It was the silence of those who had watched, the passive onlookers who had turned away or kept their heads low. She couldn't stop replaying the scene in her mind, the smugness in his tone, the subtle dig of his words that had been as calculated as they were cruel. Back at her office, Maya sat at her desk, staring at the neat stacks of papers and the glowing computer screen in front of her. A photo of her son, Jordan, sat in a frame next to her monitor, his gap-toothed smile reminding her why she did what she did. She picked up her phone, scrolling through the countless emails and reports she needed to address, but her focus was elsewhere. The encounter with Darren wasn't something she could simply file away. It wasn't about her pride or ego, it was about the pattern, the system that allowed someone like him to thrive without accountability. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her assistant, Carla, knocking softly on the door before stepping inside. Carla was a kind-hearted woman in her 40s with a knack for organization and a sharp eye for detail. She glanced at Maya, her expression a mix of concern and hesitation. "I heard about what happened earlier," Carla said, her voice low but steady. "Are you okay?" Maya looked up, offering a small, tired smile. "I'm fine, Carla. I've dealt with worse." Carla closed the door behind her and leaned against the frame, crossing her arms. "You shouldn't have to deal with it at all. Darren's been a problem for years. You know that as well as I do." Maya's lips tightened into a thin line. She knew Carla was right. Darren's name had come across her desk more times than she could count, always attached to complaints that were brushed aside or dismissed. But she also knew that taking action against him would mean navigating a web of politics and pushback. "I'm aware," Maya said after a moment. "But this isn't just about Darren. It's bigger than him. If I make this about one officer, we'll be treating the symptom, not the disease." Carla nodded, her gaze softening. "I just don't want you to feel like you have to carry this alone. There are people in this department who believe in what you're doing, Maya. Don't forget that." Maya gave a small nod of acknowledgement, but the weight of her responsibilities didn't lessen. She leaned back in her chair, exhaling deeply. "Thanks, Carla. I appreciate it." As Carla left, Maya's mind shifted to the bigger picture. Darren's actions weren't just about one man's bias, they were a reflection of a system that had allowed such behavior to go unchecked. She couldn't let it slide, not this time. But how could she address it in a way that would lead to real change? She knew the risks of pushing too hard, of making too many waves. But she also knew what was at stake if she didn't. Meanwhile, Darren was on his way home, his jaw clenched as he replayed the encounter in his mind. He still didn't know who the woman was, and that fact gnawed at him. Something about her composure, the way she had refused to back down, had unsettled him more than he cared to admit. But instead of questioning his own behavior, Darren chose to frame it as her defiance, her unwillingness to respect his authority. When he arrived home, he tossed his keys onto the counter and sank into the worn couch in his living room. The television droned on in the background, but he wasn't paying attention. His mind was elsewhere, fixating on the woman in the park. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had missed something, some detail that would have explained why she hadn't reacted the way most people did when confronted by him. It wasn't fear, there had been none of that in her eyes. It was something else, something he couldn't quite place. Darren's phone buzzed on the coffee table, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a text from one of his colleagues, Officer Baker, asking if he wanted to grab a drink later. Darren typed out a quick response, agreeing to meet at their usual spot. He needed the distraction, something to shake the unease that had settled in his chest. Later that evening, as Darren and Baker sat at the bar, nursing their beers, the conversation inevitably turned to work. Baker was one of the few people Darren considered a friend, someone who shared his views on how the department should operate. They often commiserated about the changes in the department, lamenting the push for reforms and what they saw as unnecessary oversight. "That new deputy chief," Baker said, shaking his head. "She's a piece of work, isn't she? Always talking about accountability and transparency. It's like she doesn't get what we're up against out there." Darren frowned, the mention of Maya sparking a flicker of recognition. "What's her name again?" he asked, trying to keep his tone casual. "Maya Williams," Baker replied. "Why?" Darren's grip tightened on his beer bottle, his mind racing. The name was familiar, too familiar. He thought back to the woman in the park, the way she had stood her ground, the way she had looked at him with an expression that now made sense in hindsight. He felt a cold knot of realization forming in his stomach. "I think I ran into her today," Darren said slowly, his voice laced with disbelief. "But I didn't know who she was." Baker raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Darren hesitated, his mind flashing back to the encounter. He didn't want to admit the full extent of what had happened, not even to Baker. "Let's just say it wasn't a great first impression." Baker laughed, clapping Darren on the shoulder. "Well, good luck with that. She's not the kind to let things slide." Darren forced a chuckle, but inside, panic was starting to set in. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had made a grave mistake, one that could come back to haunt him in ways he couldn't yet predict. Back at the department, Maya was preparing for what lay ahead. She knew that addressing Darren's behavior wouldn't be easy, but she also knew that it was necessary. She had already begun gathering evidence, pulling records and reviewing complaints that had been swept under the rug. This wasn't just about holding Darren accountable, it was about setting a precedent, about sending a message that the culture of silence and complicity would no longer be tolerated. As the pieces began to fall into place, Maya couldn't help but feel a mix of anticipation and apprehension. The path she had chosen was fraught with challenges, but she was ready to face them head-on. And while Darren had yet to realize the full extent of the storm heading his way, Maya knew that the moment of reckoning was fast approaching. The question wasn't whether justice would be served, it was how Darren would respond when the truth finally came to light. The day began as any other at the precinct, the usual hum of chatter and shuffling papers filling the air. Darren arrived early, his movements brisk as he settled into his desk, but there was an unshakable tension in his posture. He had spent the weekend replaying the moment in the park, piecing together what he now realized had been a colossal mistake. The nagging sense of unease had transformed into outright dread when he finally connected the dots. Maya Williams wasn't just another citizen he could dismiss. She was his superior, the one person in the department who had the power, and likely the resolve, to hold him accountable. Across the building, Maya walked into the precinct with her usual composed demeanor, though there was a quiet intensity in her eyes. She had spent the last 2 days reviewing every detail of Darren's record, combing through the complaints and misconduct reports that had been swept under the rug. What she found wasn't surprising, but it was infuriating. Darren wasn't just careless or insensitive, he was emblematic of a larger problem, a culture that protected its own at the expense of justice. Today wasn't just about confronting him. It was about setting a precedent, about drawing a line in the sand. Maya moved through the station, her heels clicking against the floor as she approached the conference room where she had called a meeting with several senior officers, including Darren. She carried a folder under her arm, its contents meticulously organized. She pushed the door open, and the room fell silent as everyone turned to look at her. Darren sat near the end of the table, his jaw tightening when their eyes met. "Good morning, everyone," Maya said, her voice calm but firm as she placed the folder on the table. "Before we begin, I'd like to address an incident that occurred recently." The officers exchanged glances, the air growing heavier with each passing second. Darren shifted in his seat, his discomfort palpable. Maya's gaze swept over the room, her expression unreadable, before she fixed her attention on Darren. "Officer Mitchell," she said, her tone sharper now, "I believe you had an interaction with me last Friday at Lincoln Park." Darren swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. I didn't realize it was you, Deputy Chief." Maya's lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. "No, you didn't. But that's precisely the problem, isn't it? You didn't recognize me, and yet you felt justified in questioning my presence, in making assumptions about who I was and what I was doing. Would you care to explain that?" The room was so quiet that the sound of Darren clearing his throat seemed deafening. I thought you looked suspicious," he stammered, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. "It was a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding," Maya repeated, her voice low but cutting. "Tell me, Officer Mitchell, how often do you find yourself misunderstanding situations like this? Because according to your record, this isn't an isolated incident." Darren's face flushed with a mix of anger and embarrassment. "I was doing my job," he said, his voice rising defensively. "It wasn't personal." "Wasn't personal?" Maya's tone sharpened, and she leaned forward slightly, her gaze piercing. "You accused me of not belonging, of being out of place, in a public park. You humiliated me in front of strangers, and now you're telling me it wasn't personal? Let me ask you this, if I were someone else, someone who looked different, would you have approached me the same way?" Darren opened his mouth to respond but hesitated, his mind racing for an answer that wouldn't make things worse. The silence stretched uncomfortably before Maya spoke again. "I've reviewed your record, Officer Mitchell," she said, her voice steady but laden with authority. "The complaints against you paint a clear picture: excessive force, inappropriate language, racially biased behavior. You've managed to avoid accountability so far, but that ends today." The room seemed to hold its collective breath as Maya reached for the folder, pulling out several documents and placing them on the table. These are the reports filed against you over the years, she continued. Complaints that were dismissed, overlooked, or ignored entirely. But not anymore. I've already spoken to Internal Affairs, and they'll be conducting a thorough investigation into your conduct. Darren's hands clenched into fists under the table, his anger bubbling just beneath the surface. You can't do this, he said, his voice low and strained. I've been with this department for over a decade. I've served this city. You've abused your power, Maya interrupted, her tone unyielding. And you've done it because you thought no one would hold you accountable. But you were wrong. This isn't just about you, Officer Mitchell. This is about ensuring that no one else in this department follows your example. The tension in the room was suffocating. Darren's face was a mixture of defiance and fear, his mind scrambling for a way out. But deep down, he knew there was no escaping this. Maya's words were a mirror, forcing him to confront the reality he had long ignored. The other officers sat in stunned silence, their expressions ranging from shock to unease. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others avoided eye contact altogether. The weight of what was happening wasn't lost on them. They weren't just witnessing a reckoning, they were part of it. As the meeting concluded, Maya gathered her documents and stood, her gaze lingering on Darren for a moment longer. You'll be placed on administrative leave effective immediately, she said, her voice firm. Internal Affairs will handle the rest. Darren didn't respond. He couldn't. The gravity of his situation had finally sunk in, and all he could do was sit there, his mind racing with regret and resentment. Maya walked out of the room, her footsteps steady and unyielding, leaving behind a silence that spoke volumes. For Darren, the realization was crushing. He had always believed himself untouchable, protected by the very system he had exploited. But now, that illusion was shattered. And for Maya, this was just the beginning. The path ahead would be long and difficult, but she was ready. Justice wasn't just an ideal, it was a choice, a commitment, and she had made hers. What Darren didn't yet understand was that his reckoning wasn't just about consequences. It was about change, and that change was already in motion. As the hours dragged on after the meeting, the atmosphere in the precinct was charged with an uneasy tension. Word of what had transpired spread quickly among the officers, whispers filling the hallways as Maya's actions became the central topic of discussion. Darren sat at his desk, his posture rigid, his face pale. He stared at the paperwork in front of him, unable to focus, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on him like a crushing force. He replayed every word Maya had said, every pointed glance and cutting remark, and with each memory, his anger grew. The humiliation burned deeply, and yet, beneath the fury, there was something else, something he couldn't name but that gnawed at him all the same. He looked up as Baker approached, his colleague's face a mix of pity and discomfort. Baker hesitated before speaking, his voice low and cautious. "You okay, man?" he asked, leaning against the edge of Darren's desk. "I mean, that was brutal back there." Darren didn't look at him, his jaw clenched tightly. "She's trying to ruin me," he muttered, his tone seething with resentment. "That's all this is. She wants to make an example out of me, and she doesn't care how many lies she has to tell to do it." Baker frowned, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "I don't know, Darren. It sounds like she's got the receipts. Complaints, records. If she's gone to Internal Affairs, this isn't just going to blow over." Darren's eyes flashed with frustration as he finally turned to face Baker. "You think I don't know that? You think I don't know how bad this looks? But you don't get it. She's been out to get me since she got here. All this reform talk, all this accountability nonsense, it's not about making things better. It's about tearing people like me down. People like you." Baker raised an eyebrow, his tone skeptical. "Or people who've gotten away with too much for too long." Darren shot him a sharp look, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Careful, Baker. I'm not in the mood for lectures. Baker held up his hands in a placating gesture but didn't back down entirely. I'm just saying, maybe it's time to take a good, hard look at things. You've been on this job a long time, Darren. Maybe there's something to what she's saying. Darren scoffed, shaking his head. You sound just like her. You don't know what it's like out there, Baker. You don't know what we deal with, day in and day out. She sits in her office, talking about fairness and justice, but she doesn't understand the realities of the job. Maybe, Baker conceded, his tone neutral. But from where I'm standing, it looks like she understands a hell of a lot more than you want to admit. The words hit Darren harder than he expected, and he turned away, refusing to let Baker see the flicker of doubt that crossed his face. Baker lingered for a moment longer before walking away, leaving Darren alone with his thoughts. Meanwhile, Maya was in her office, her focus unyielding as she prepared for the next steps. The confrontation with Darren had been only the beginning, and she knew the backlash was coming. There were already murmurs among some of the officers, a quiet resistance to her leadership that had been simmering beneath the surface since the day she took the job. But she wasn't here to make friends. She was here to make a difference, and that meant standing firm, even when it felt like the weight of the entire department was against her. Her phone buzzed on the desk, and she picked it up to see a message from Carla. The words were simple but reassuring, "You're doing the right thing. Don't let them get to you." Maya allowed herself a small smile before putting the phone down and returning to her work. She was reviewing the details of the investigation into Darren, every piece of evidence meticulously organized, when a knock on the door interrupted her. She looked up to see Captain Lewis, the precinct's commanding officer, standing in the doorway. "Got a minute?" Lewis asked, his tone polite but serious. Maya gestured for him to come in, and he closed the door behind him before taking a seat across from her. He was an older man, with graying hair and a demeanor that spoke of decades of experience. But there was a guardedness in his expression that Maya recognized immediately. "I've been hearing a lot about what went down today," Lewis began, his voice measured. "You've certainly stirred things up." Maya met his gaze evenly. "Is that a problem?" Lewis hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "It depends on how this plays out. You've put a spotlight on Darren, and by extension, the entire department. That kind of scrutiny can be challenging." "Challenging for who?" Maya asked, her tone sharp. "The officers who've been complicit. The ones who've ignored the complaints and allowed behavior like Darren's to go unchecked. If that's who we're worried about, then maybe they should feel uncomfortable." Lewis sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I'm not saying you're wrong, Maya. But you know as well as I do that this kind of change doesn't come easy. People resist it. They push back. And sometimes, they push back hard." "I'm aware," Maya said firmly. "But that doesn't mean we stop. If we don't hold people like Darren accountable, we're sending a message that this kind of behavior is acceptable. And I won't be a part of that." Lewis studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded, a hint of respect in his eyes. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. Just be careful. This kind of fight can take a toll, and I don't want to see you burn out before you've had the chance to make a real impact." Maya nodded in acknowledgement, though her resolve remained unshaken. "Thank you, Captain. But I'm not backing down." As Lewis left the office, Maya leaned back in her chair, exhaling deeply. The fight ahead was daunting, but she was ready. Darren's reckoning was inevitable, and she would see it through, no matter what it took. She knew the road wouldn't be easy, but she also knew she wasn't alone. There were others in the department who believed in her vision, who wanted to see the change she was fighting for. And with their support, she would keep pushing forward, one step at a time. What Darren didn't yet realize was that his actions had set off a chain reaction, one that couldn't be undone. The storm was coming, and he was at the center of it. Whether he liked it or not, the truth was about to come to light, and when it did, there would be no going back. The precinct was quiet in the days following the meeting, but the silence wasn't one of calm, it was tension, stretched tight like a wire ready to snap. Darren's absence was felt in every corner, and the knowledge of the ongoing investigation into his behavior lingered like an unspoken question in the air. Officers whispered in hallways, quick glances exchanged as they passed Maya in the corridors. Her presence was a reminder that the usual rules of silence and complicity no longer applied, and that shift left many unsettled. Maya, however, maintained her composure. She moved through her days with the same steady determination that had carried her through years of challenges, but even she could feel the pressure mounting. The investigation into Darren was progressing, and with every piece of evidence that surfaced, the scope of his misconduct became clearer. It wasn't just his treatment of her in the park, there were years of complaints, testimonies from citizens, even reports from other officers who had been too afraid to come forward until now. The pattern was undeniable, and yet Maya knew that uncovering the truth was only half the battle. The real challenge would be making sure it led to lasting change. She was in her office one afternoon, reviewing the latest updates from internal affairs, when Carla knocked on the door and stepped inside. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a heaviness in her posture that caught Maya's attention immediately. "There's something you need to see," Carla said, handing her a tablet. "It's already making the rounds online." Maya took the tablet, her brow furrowing as she opened the link Carla had pulled up. It was a video, grainy but clear enough to see the scene unfold. It was the incident in the park, the confrontation with Darren, recorded by someone who had been passing by. Maya watched in silence as the clip played out, Darren's voice sharp and condescending, his tone dripping with authority as he demanded her ID. The recording ended with Maya's calm but firm response, her refusal to back down even as Darren's frustration grew. When the video finished, Maya handed the tablet back to Carla, her expression unreadable. "How long has this been out there?" "Just a few hours," Carla replied. "But it's already going viral. People are sharing it, commenting on it. There's a lot of support for you, but there's backlash too." Maya nodded, her mind racing as she processed the implications. The video was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it exposed Darren's behavior in a way that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. On the other, it put Maya in the spotlight in a way she hadn't anticipated. She knew there would be those who would try to twist the narrative, to paint her as a troublemaker or an opportunist. "Has Darren seen it?" she asked. Carla hesitated before answering. "I don't know. But I wouldn't be surprised if he has. This kind of thing, it spreads fast." Maya sighed, leaning back in her chair. "This is going to complicate things." "Maybe," Carla said, her voice soft but steady. "But it also puts the truth out there. People are seeing what really happened. That's got to count for something." Maya nodded, though her thoughts were still racing. The truth was out there now, but it also meant the stakes were higher than ever. Every move she made from this point on would be scrutinized, every decision analyzed and picked apart. She couldn't afford to make a mistake. Meanwhile, Darren was at home, his phone buzzing incessantly as messages and notifications poured in. He had seen the video, and the sight of it had sent a cold wave of panic through him. It was one thing to face consequences within the department, but this was public. His actions were no longer just a matter of internal review, they were out in the open, exposed for the world to see. He paced his living room, the tension in his chest building with every passing second. His thoughts were a chaotic mix of anger, fear, and a growing sense of inevitability. He had spent years believing he was untouchable, that his badge and his tenure would protect him from any real consequences. But now, that shield was crumbling, and he didn't know how to stop it. The knock at his door startled him, and he hesitated before opening it to find Baker standing on his porch. His colleague's expression was grim, his hands shoved into his pockets as he shifted uncomfortably. "Mind if I come in?" Baker asked. Darren stepped aside, letting him in without a word. They sat in silence for a moment, the tension between them palpable. "I saw the video," Baker said finally, his voice heavy. "It's bad, Darren. Real bad." Darren scoffed, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "You think I don't know that? You think I haven't been dealing with it all day?" "I'm not here to rub it in," Baker said, his tone measured. "But you need to face reality. This isn't going away. The department's not going to sweep this under the rug, not with the way it's blowing up. What do you want me to do?" Darren snapped, his voice sharp. "Throw myself at her mercy? Beg for forgiveness? She's already made up her mind about me." "Maybe," Baker admitted. "But you've got a choice to make. You can keep fighting this, keep denying everything, and see where that gets you. Or you can own up to it, take responsibility, and try to salvage what's left." Darren stared at him, his jaw tight, his mind racing. The idea of admitting fault, of acknowledging the damage he had caused, was almost unbearable. But deep down, he knew Baker was right. The walls were closing in, and if he didn't act soon, there would be nothing left to salvage. Back at the precinct, Maya was preparing for the next step. The video had changed the game, but it hadn't changed her resolve. If anything, it had only strengthened her determination to see this through. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but she also knew she wasn't alone. The truth was out there now, and with it came a sense of vindication, but also a heavy burden of responsibility. As she sat in her office, reviewing the final details of the investigation, her thoughts turned to Darren. She wondered if he understood the gravity of what was happening, if he had begun to see the cracks in the foundation he had built his career on. She didn't know if he was capable of change, but she hoped, for his sake and for the sake of the department, that he was. The fallout from the video was just beginning, and the consequences would ripple far beyond the walls of the precinct. But for Maya, this wasn't just about Darren. It was about the future of the department, about creating a culture where accountability wasn't the exception but the rule. And as she prepared for the next chapter of this fight, she knew one thing for certain: the battle was far from over. The tension within the precinct had reached a boiling point. Every officer seemed to move with a cautious awareness, their voices quieter, their interactions tinged with a palpable unease. Darren's absence had left a void, but it was far from a peaceful one. The video had thrown everything into sharp focus, igniting discussions, arguments, and even moments of self-reflection among those who had always chosen silence. For Maya, it wasn't just about the backlash or the scrutiny, it was about the fact that people were finally paying attention, even if reluctantly. In her office, Maya sat across from Captain Lewis once again. His demeanor was more serious than usual, his brow furrowed as he leaned forward in his chair. Between them was a folder containing the latest findings from internal affairs. The evidence was damning: interviews, witness statements, corroborated accounts of Darren's behavior spanning years. There was no question about what needed to happen next, but the weight of that decision still lingered in the room. "We've got everything we need," Lewis said, his voice low but firm. "This is enough to justify termination and then some. The question is, how do we handle it?" Maya folded her hands on the desk, her expression steady but reflective. "We handle it by being transparent. No cover-ups, no half-measures. If we don't hold him accountable publicly, we're just feeding into the same system that allowed this to happen in the first place." Lewis nodded slowly, though his expression remained troubled. "You're right, but it's going to stir up a lot of trouble. Darren's been here a long time. He's got friends, allies. People who'll say this is some kind of witch hunt. Let them," Maya said, her tone sharp. "This isn't about personal vendettas or politics. It's about integrity. If they can't see that, then maybe they're part of the problem too." Lewis studied her for a long moment, his gaze thoughtful. Finally, he sighed, leaning back in his chair. "You've got guts, Deputy Chief. I'll give you that. Just make sure you're ready for the fallout. This isn't going to be clean." Maya nodded, though she already knew that. She had accepted the risks the moment she decided to pursue this course of action. The path to accountability was never easy, but it was necessary, and she wasn't about to back down now. Meanwhile, Darren sat in his car, parked just outside the precinct. He hadn't gone inside, couldn't bring himself to face the looks, the whispers, the judgment he knew awaited him. Instead, he stared through the windshield, his thoughts a chaotic mix of anger, regret, and something else he couldn't quite name. The weight of his decisions, of the years he had spent ignoring the consequences of his actions, was finally catching up to him, and he didn't know how to face it. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat, and he glanced at the screen to see a message from Baker. It was short and to the point, "You need to talk to her. Now." Darren exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. He knew Baker was right. This wasn't something he could run from, no matter how much he wanted to. If he didn't take control of the situation, it would consume him entirely. With a heavy sigh, he picked up the phone and dialed a number he had never expected to use. Maya answered after the second ring, her voice calm but tinged with surprise. "This is Deputy Chief Williams." "It's Darren," he said, his voice tight. "I need to talk to you." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Darren could almost feel her hesitation before she responded. "I'll be in my office for the next hour. If you're serious about talking, come find me." The line went dead, and Darren sat there for a moment, his heart pounding. He wasn't sure if he was ready for this conversation, but he knew he didn't have a choice. With a deep breath, he stepped out of the car and headed into the precinct, each step heavier than the last. When he reached her office, he knocked softly before opening the door. Maya looked up from her desk, her expression unreadable as she gestured for him to come in. He closed the door behind him, the silence stretching between them like a chasm. "I wasn't sure you'd actually show up," Maya said, her tone measured. "Neither was I," Darren admitted, his voice low. He hesitated, struggling to find the right words. "I saw the video." Maya's gaze didn't waver. And I get it," he said, though the words felt heavy on his tongue. "I get why you're doing this. Why you're coming after me. But you have to understand, it wasn't personal." Maya's eyes narrowed slightly, her voice sharpening. "Not personal. You humiliated me in front of strangers, made assumptions about me based on nothing but the color of my skin, and you're telling me it wasn't personal?" "Darren, everything about what you did was personal." Darren winced, the weight of her words sinking in. He looked away, his jaw tightening. "I screwed up. I know that. I've screwed up a lot of things over the years, and maybe I didn't realize it before, but I see it now." Maya studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "Do you?" "Because seeing it isn't enough, Darren. Acknowledging it isn't enough. You've spent years abusing your position, ignoring the consequences of your actions. Do you have any idea how much damage you've done? Not just to me, but to the people you were supposed to protect. To this department." Darren swallowed hard, his throat tight. I didn't think it mattered. I thought I was doing what needed to be done." "What needed to be done?" Maya repeated, her voice rising. "Harassing innocent people. Abusing your authority. Tell me, Darren, when did any of that ever need to be done?" The silence that followed was deafening, and Darren felt the weight of her words pressing down on him. He had no answer, no defense. All he could do was sit there, his shoulders slumped, as the reality of his actions finally settled over him. Maya leaned back in her chair, her gaze steady. "I don't know if you can fix this, Darren. I don't even know if you want to. But if you're serious about trying, then you need to start by taking responsibility. No more excuses, no more justifications. Own up to what you've done, and maybe, just maybe, you'll find a way to make things right." Darren nodded slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. I'll try. Trying isn't enough, Maya said firmly. But it's a start. Now get out of my office. You've got a lot of work to do. As Darren stood and walked out, the weight in his chest felt heavier than ever, but for the first time, there was a sliver of something else, hope. It was fragile, tentative, but it was there. And as he stepped back into the precinct, he realized that the path ahead wouldn't be easy. But maybe, just maybe, it would be worth it. The precinct was quieter than usual, the air heavy with a mix of anticipation and unease. Darren's conversation with Maya had left him shaken in ways he hadn't anticipated. He had walked out of her office with the weight of her words pressing down on him, each one a sharp reminder of the choices he'd made, the damage he'd caused. As he sat in his car outside the precinct, staring at the steering wheel, he found himself replaying the conversation over and over. He hadn't expected her to be so direct, so unwavering, and yet he knew she was right. Trying wasn't enough, not if it didn't lead to real change. Inside, Maya was working late again. Her desk was covered with reports, notes, and the ever-present weight of responsibility that seemed to follow her everywhere she went. The video had continued to gain traction, sparking conversations far beyond the walls of the precinct. Community leaders had reached out, offering their support, while others demanded more action, more accountability. Maya welcomed the attention. It was the kind of pressure that forced change, but it also brought new challenges. Every step forward seemed to come with new obstacles, new voices questioning her decisions and motivations. Carla knocked softly before stepping into the office, her face a mix of concern and curiosity. She placed a cup of coffee on Maya's desk and hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I saw Darren leave earlier. He looked different. What happened?" Maya leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples before letting out a tired sigh. "He came to talk. I think he's starting to realize just how much damage he's done. But whether that leads to real change or just more excuses, I don't know." Carla nodded slowly, pulling up a chair. "Do you think he meant it? What he said?" Maya considered the question carefully before answering. "I think he's scared. Scared of losing everything, scared of being seen for who he really is. But fear isn't enough to change someone. He needs to face the consequences, and he needs to want to do better, not because he's afraid, but because it's the right thing to do." Carla sipped her coffee, her gaze thoughtful. "Do you think people like him can really change?" "I don't know," Maya admitted. "But I have to believe it's possible. Because if I don't, then what's the point of any of this?" The two women sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the conversation settling between them. Finally, Carla stood, offering a small smile. "You're doing the right thing, Maya. Even if it doesn't feel like it right now." As Carla left, Maya turned her attention back to the reports in front of her. She had spent years fighting battles like this, each one leaving its mark, but she refused to let it break her. This wasn't just about Darren or the precinct, it was about the bigger picture, about creating a system where accountability wasn't just a buzzword but a reality. And she knew that wouldn't happen overnight. Meanwhile, Darren sat in the living room of his small apartment, the silence around him almost deafening. The television was on, but he wasn't watching. His phone buzzed on the coffee table, notifications piling up as messages from colleagues, friends, and even strangers poured in. He had avoided social media since the video surfaced, unable to face the barrage of criticism and judgment that awaited him there. But even without looking, he knew what people were saying. He had become a symbol, not just of his own failures but of a system that had allowed those failures to go unchecked for so long. The sound of a knock at the door startled him, and he hesitated before getting up to answer it. To his surprise, it was Baker again, his expression unreadable as he stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. Darren closed the door behind him, feeling a mix of irritation and gratitude at his colleague's persistence. "You're not making this easy for yourself, you know that," Baker said, crossing his arms as he leaned against the wall. Darren frowned, sinking back onto the couch. "What do you want me to do, Baker? Pretend like everything's fine?" "It's not." "No, it's not," Baker agreed. "But sitting here feeling sorry for yourself isn't going to fix anything either. You've got a chance to do something about this, Darren. A real chance. Don't waste it." Darren ran a hand through his hair, his frustration boiling over. "Do what, exactly? Go out there and grovel? Say I'm sorry and hope that makes it all go away?" "It's not about making it go away," Baker said firmly. "It's about owning up to what you did, to the people you hurt. You can't change the past, but you can decide what kind of person you're going to be moving forward." Darren stared at him, his jaw tight, his mind racing. He wanted to argue, to push back, but deep down, he knew Baker was right. He had spent years justifying his actions, convincing himself that he was doing what needed to be done, but now those excuses felt hollow. The realization was painful, almost unbearable, but it was also unavoidable. The next morning, Darren arrived at the precinct early. The weight of what he was about to do pressed heavily on his shoulders, but there was a strange sense of clarity that came with it. He walked past his colleagues, their conversations halting as they watched him, and made his way to Maya's office. She looked up as he knocked on the door, her expression unreadable as he stepped inside. "I need to say something," he said, his voice steady despite the nervous energy coursing through him. Maya gestured for him to sit, her gaze unwavering. "I'm listening." Darren took a deep breath, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. "I've made a lot of mistakes. More than I can count. And I can't undo what I've done, but I want to try to make things right. I don't know where to start, but I know it has to start with me taking responsibility." Maya leaned forward, her expression softening slightly. "Why now, Darren? What's changed?" He hesitated, searching for the right words. I think I've spent so much time trying to prove I was in control, that I knew what I was doing, that I never stopped to think about the people I was hurting. And now, seeing it all laid out in front of me, I can't ignore it anymore." Maya studied him carefully, her gaze piercing. "This isn't going to be easy. Owning up to what you've done means facing the consequences, all of them. Are you ready for that?" "I don't think I'll ever be ready," Darren admitted. "But I know it's the only way forward." Maya nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "Then let's start there. But understand this, Darren, this isn't about redemption. It's about accountability. If you're serious about this, you have to commit to the work, no matter how hard it gets." Darren met her gaze, the weight of her words sinking in. "I understand." As he left her office, there was a sense of finality in the air, but also the faintest hint of possibility. For Darren, this was the beginning of a journey he had never expected to take, one that would challenge him in ways he couldn't yet imagine. And for Maya, it was a reminder of why she had chosen this path, to create a world where accountability wasn't just a possibility but a reality. Months had passed since the investigation into Darren Mitchell had concluded, and the precinct was no longer the same. The weight of accountability had left its mark, not just on Darren, but on everyone within those walls. Maya had ensured that the process was as transparent as possible, the findings made public and the consequences clear. Darren was terminated from his position, his badge and gun handed over in a quiet, somber ceremony attended only by Internal Affairs and Maya herself. There were no dramatic outbursts, no angry protests, just a man finally confronting the reality of his actions. For Darren, the road after that day was anything but easy. The loss of his career had left him adrift, forced to reckon with a world he had spent years trying to control but had never truly understood. At first, he resisted the urge to reflect, falling into a spiral of anger and bitterness. But as time passed, the words Maya had spoken to him echoed louder. Taking responsibility wasn't just about facing the consequences, it was about doing the work to make things right. Slowly, painfully, Darren began to rebuild. He started volunteering at a local community center, working with at-risk youth and listening to their stories. For the first time, he saw the world through their eyes, through the eyes of those he had failed to protect, those he had dismissed and disregarded. The work didn't erase his mistakes, but it gave him a new purpose, a chance to contribute in a way that mattered. At the precinct, Maya's leadership continued to reshape the culture. Her push for reform wasn't without resistance, but the momentum had shifted. The public's response to the video and the investigation had made it clear that change was no longer optional. Maya implemented new training programs focused on de-escalation and community engagement, along with stricter protocols for addressing complaints and misconduct. She knew the work would take years, even decades, but every step forward felt like a victory. The officers who remained began to see her vision, recognizing that accountability didn't weaken their role, it strengthened it. Trust, once shattered, was slowly being rebuilt, one conversation, one policy, one action at a time. Maya's personal life, too, found a sense of balance that had long eluded her. She spent more time with her son, Jordan, who had watched her battle with admiration and pride. To him, his mother wasn't just a leader, she was a hero. They would often sit together in the evenings, talking about his school projects, his dreams, and the kind of world he wanted to live in. Maya made sure he understood the importance of standing up for what was right, even when it was hard. She wanted him to know that change was possible, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. One day, months after everything had unfolded, Maya received a letter in her office. It was from Darren. She hesitated before opening it, unsure of what to expect. The handwriting was uneven, the tone raw, but the words carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. Darren thanked her, not for what she had done to him, but for what she had forced him to see. He admitted he didn't know if he could ever fully atone for his actions, but he was trying, one day at a time. He described the work he was doing at the community center, how it had opened his eyes to a reality he had spent years avoiding. He didn't ask for forgiveness, only understanding. By the time she finished reading, Maya sat back in her chair, the letter resting in her hands. She didn't smile, but there was a quiet sense of closure in her expression. The ripple effects of the entire ordeal reached far beyond the precinct. Community leaders, activists, and everyday citizens began to push for similar reforms across the city, inspired by what Maya had achieved. The conversations sparked by the video didn't fade, they grew louder, more insistent. Maya found herself invited to panels and discussions, her voice becoming one of the many calling for systemic change. She didn't see herself as a savior, but as a part of a movement much bigger than any one person. And that, to her, was the most important part. For Darren, life was quieter now, simpler. He still struggled with the weight of his past, but he had learned to carry it without letting it consume him. He knew he would never be the man he once thought he was, but he had come to accept that. Redemption wasn't a destination, it was a process, one he would have to work at every day for the rest of his life. And that was enough. Maya, too, knew her work was far from over. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but she walked it with the same determination that had carried her through every challenge. She wasn't fighting for herself, she was fighting for her son, for her community, for every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. And she wasn't alone. Together, they were building something stronger, something better, brick by brick. As you've listened to this story, what thoughts have crossed your mind? Have you felt the anger, the frustration, the hope? This isn't just a story about one person's mistakes or another's triumph. It's a story about all of us, the systems we build, the choices we make, and the courage it takes to face the truth. What would you have done if you were in Maya's position? Or Darren's? How do we hold ourselves accountable for the world we create? Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts and continue the conversation. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist for more narratives that challenge, inspire, and leave you thinking long after they're over. Hit the like button, share this video, and join us as we explore more tales of resilience, justice, and humanity. Thank you for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.